Thank you for joining for our part 2 of this study, the Lunar Sabbath Teaching Exposed from endtimesprophecy.org. Let me begin with a word of prayer. Let us bow our heads as we seek the Lord in prayer. Our Father in heaven, as I continue to read this article, may it be that as we study and as we investigate for ourselves, we may be equipped and understand and be corrected, rebuked, and be admonished, encouraged, that will lead us to truth. May your Spirit, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ, your Son, be with us. In his name I pray, amen. In Acts chapter 20, verse 6 to 7, we have an account of Paul traveling and staying in Troas. We are told that he leaves Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is celebrated from the 15th of the month to the 21st. So we can conclude that Paul travels to Troas on the 22nd, which interestingly is a Sabbath for lunar Sabbath keepers. But even if Paul left for Troas on the 23rd, you will see this doesn't work out for lunar Sabbath keepers. So let us base it on Paul leaving Philippi on the 22nd of the month and use the lunar calendar. They journeyed for 5 days, 22nd to 26th. They stay in Troas 7 days, 26th to 2nd. This includes the 30th and new moon day. Leave the first day of the week. That's the 2nd. According to the lunar Sabbath keepers, the first day of the week always fall on the 2nd of the month. So this fits the lunar Sabbath right. But did you notice something? We have to include new moon day and the 30th of the month in the numbering of days to make Acts 20 fit the lunar Sabbath calendar and teaching, whereas you had to remove new moon day and 30th of the month to make the lunar calendar for the Feast of Weeks, 50 days, as shown above. This is a major contradiction. Let me show you some more issues with the lunar Sabbath teaching. There is an instance when Israel had to depart from their camp at Sinai to journey to Paran, which shows the lunar Sabbath as wrong. This is recorded in Numbers chapter 10, verses 11 to 12. We are told that the cloud was taken up from Sinai on the 20th day of the month, verse 11. And the Israelites departed and journeyed 3 days, according to verse 30. Now, which day of the month would have been included in the 3-day journey of the Israelites? The 22nd of the month. A date which the lunar Sabbath keepers say is the 7th-day Sabbath. And yet God made the Israelites journey on this day, which is supposed to be a day of holy rest. Do you see the issue? In Numbers 15, we are told of the account of God putting a man to death for gathering sticks to make fire in the 7th-day Sabbath. And yet here in Numbers 10, we are supposed to believe that God made the whole camp of Israel journey with all their belongings on the Sabbath? I don't think so. The 22nd of each month could not be the Sabbath. Also, we are told in Exodus chapter 16, verse 1, that the Israelites journeyed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin on 15th day of the 2nd month. The 15th day of the month, according to the lunar Sabbath keepers, is another weekly Sabbath. And they use Exodus 16 as evidence of the lunar Sabbath due to Israel arriving at the wilderness of Sin on the 15th, and then God telling them he would give them manna for 6 days, but none of this on the 7th, making the assumption that the next 7th-day Sabbath was the 22nd. But for Israel to arrive at the wilderness of Sin on September 15th, it means they would have still journeyed during part of that day and then also set up camp on that day. Again, God would have caused them to journey on any part of the weekly Sabbath and also set up camp? No. Now, to make their lunar calendar fit, lunar Sabbath keepers had to make new moon day a special set-apart day that is not included in the weekly cycle. And yet, when we look at certain scriptures, this doesn't fit at all. Exodus chapter 40, verses 2 and 17. On the first day of the first month shalt thou set up the tabernacle of the tent of the congregation. And it came to pass in the first month, in the 2nd year, on the first day of the month, that this tabernacle was reared up. Numbers 1, verses 1 and 2 and 18. And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation, the first day of the 2nd month in the 2nd year, after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take ye of the sum of the congregation of the children of Israel, after their families, by the house of their fathers, with the number of their with the number of their names, every male by their polls. And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month, and they declared their pedigrees after their families by the house of their fathers, according to the number of the names from 20 years old and upward by their polls. According the lunar Sabbath keepers, the first day of the month is so special that it's not counted in the weekly cycle. And yet God had the Israelites to set up the tabernacle or hard work on that day, and also had them take a poll, the numbers of Israelites on the first day. Does this sound like such a special day that it's not counted in the weekly cycle? Genesis chapter 1, verses 16 to 6 to 19. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created had made. So when did God make the moon? He made it on the fourth day of creation. And what about the Sabbath day? He instituted on the seventh day of creation. Now, we know that Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day. So what was the first full day that Adam and Eve spent together? It was the seventh-day Sabbath. And was this Sabbath day that Adam and Eve spent together determined by the moon? No, because the moon was only created 3 days prior. Okay, so what about the next Sabbath that Adam and Eve observed? That was 7 days later, right? Was that one determined by the moon? Clearly not. What about the next Sabbath? Determined by the moon? No. Also, take a look at the following quote from a letter from the Greenwich Observatory in London in 1932, responding to a question of the weekly cycle. In the Nautical Almanac for 1931, page 740, in the last paragraph, a very learned chronologist, Dr. Fotheringham, states, when we come upon clear evidence, the period of 7 days was reckoned by independently of the month, and in fact, all astronomical periods from the Jewish Church is passed into the Christian Church. Astronomer, Royal Greenwich Royal Observatory, London, 4th March 1932. Just take that in. All observable evidence shows that the 7-day weekly cycle is independent of the monthly cycle. It is probable that the Chaldeans and Egyptians did get their year in the manner indicated, observing the first rising of Sirius before the sun, but it is very far from the truth to say that either they or any other nation got the week from the changes of the moon. There is absolutely nothing in nature to suggest the weekly cycle. And so patent is this fact that the Encyclopedia Britannica article calendar says, as if the week forms neither on aliquot part of the year nor of the lunar month. Those who reject the Mosaic recital will be a loss, as the Lumber remarks, to assign it an origin having much semblance of probability. Signs of the Times, November 18, 1889, page 695. Do you see the clear biblical truth here, friends? The weekly seventh-day Sabbath from Creation Week is the only one that fits. The institution of the weekly Sabbath had no bearing on the moon, and the moon had no bearing on the weekly Sabbath. The moon was created on day 4, and there is no mention whatsoever that it would have any bearing on when the Sabbath day would be. Instead, God simply set up a weekly 7-day cycle from creation that continued, as it is this that determined the 7-day Sabbath, not the cycle of the moon. Now take a look at the following important truth concerning the Sabbath day contained in the fourth commandment. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, or thy daughter, thy manservant, or thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, thy stranger, this within thy gates. For 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Do you see what event God is pointing to in his fourth commandment? He's pointing to the creation week, and he's confirming that it is this creation event from where we get the 7th-day Sabbath. As the weekly Sabbath is a memorial of God's creation and a day that shows our allegiance to our Creator God, the only true God, and as we already shown above, the seventh-day Sabbath of creation was not determined by the moon. Do a search of Genesis and Exodus, and you will only find one mention of the moon, and that was concerning Joseph's dream of the sun, moon, and stars bowing to him. Nothing to do with the Sabbath. We will read the next time, part 3, ceremonial feast Sabbaths. May God continue to bless you and keep you. This is my prayer.